On March 9, 1974, a Japanese officer walked out of the Philippine jungle and surrendered his sword to the president of a foreign nation. He wore a tattered uniform, carried a functioning rifle, and saluted with the precision of a man who had never stopped being a soldier. His name was Hiroo Onoda. He was 52 years old. The war he had been fighting had ended 29 years earlier. Onoda's story is not simply one of extraordinary endurance or misguided loyalty. It is a window into the machinery of belief, the psychology of Imperial Japan's military indoctrination, and the unsettling reality that wars do not end cleanly for all who fight them. While the world moved forward through reconstruction, technological revolution, and generational change, Onoda remained locked in 1945, patrolling an island that had long forgotten why he was there. His war continued not because he was insane, but because he had been trained too well. Early life and the making of a soldier. Hiroo Onoda was born on March 19, 1922, in Kamikawa, a village in Wakayama Prefecture. His family was neither wealthy nor particularly distinguished. His father managed a small school, and the household was shaped by the values common to provincial Japan in the early 20th century: discipline, filial piety, and an unquestioned respect for the emperor. Onoda's childhood was unremarkable by the standards of his time. He attended local schools, worked in his family's business, and absorbed the increasingly militaristic culture that permeated Japanese society throughout the 1930s. By the time Onoda reached adolescence, Japan had already invaded Manchuria and was deep into its war with China. The empire was expanding, and with it, the expectation that every young man would serve. In 1939, at the age of 17, Onoda began working for a trading company in China. The experience introduced him to the realities of occupied territory, to the administrative machinery of empire, and to the unspoken hierarchies that govern Japanese expansion. He was not yet a soldier, but he was learning the landscape of war. In 1942, Onoda was consed into the Imperial Japanese Army. He was 20 years old. His initial assignment was to an infantry regiment, but it quickly became clear that he possessed qualities valued by military intelligence: attention to detail, patience, and an ability to think independently within the rigid structure of orders. In 1944, he was selected for training at the Nakano School, an institution that specialized in unconventional warfare, intelligence gathering, and guerrilla tactics. The Nakano School did not train ordinary soldiers. It trained men to operate alone, behind enemy lines, for indefinite periods. It trained men to survive without support, to blend into hostile terrain, and to continue fighting even when the conventional war had collapsed around them. The training was comprehensive and brutal. Students were taught sabotage, espionage, survival, and psychological resistance. They learned how to live off the land, how to construct shelters from jungle materials, and how to avoid detection by superior forces. But more importantly, they were indoctrinated with a specific ideology: the mission comes first, surrender is disgrace, and the emperor's word is absolute. This was not mere propaganda. It was a rewiring of identity. By the time Onoda graduated, he was no longer simply a soldier. He was an instrument of a cause that transcended his own survival. In December 1944, Onoda received his orders. He was to be deployed to Lubang, a small island in the Philippines, approximately 75 miles southwest of Manila. His mission was clear: conduct guerrilla operations, destroy enemy infrastructure, and delay the Allied advance. Specifically, he was to sabotage the airstrip at the island center and the port facilities along its coast. The orders came with a directive that would define the rest of his life. His commanding officer, Major Yoshima Taniguchi, told him, "You are absolutely forbidden to die by your own hand. It may take 3 years, it may take 5, but whatever happens, we'll come back for you." Lubang is not a large island. It measures roughly 18 miles in length and 9 miles at its widest point. Its terrain is dense jungle, broken by hills and narrow valleys. The climate is tropical, with heavy rains during the monsoon season and oppressive heat throughout the year. The local population, primarily Filipino farmers and fishermen, lived in scattered settlements connected by dirt paths. Before the war, the island had little strategic importance. But by late 1944, as American forces swept through the Pacific, every piece of land became a potential battlefield. Onoda arrived on Lubang with a small unit: Private First Class Yuichi Akatsu, Corporal Shoichi Shimada, and Private Kinshichi Kazuka. They were not a conventional military detachment. They were a guerrilla cell, expected to operate independently, blend into the environment, and sustain themselves indefinitely. In the final months of 1944, they carried out their initial mission. They destroyed sections of the airstrip and burned fuel supplies. They moved through the jungle at night, avoiding both American patrols and the Filipino constabulary that had begun hunting Japanese stragglers. They were successful. They were also completely cut off from the outside world. By early 1945, the Philippines had become a battleground of extraordinary violence. American forces, under General Douglas MacArthur, launched a massive campaign to retake the archipelago. The fighting on Luzon, the main island, was among the most brutal of the Pacific War. On Lubang, the situation was different. The island was bypassed. It held no strategic value worth the cost of an assault. American forces moved on. Japanese command, in disarray, sent no further orders. The soldiers left on Lubang, including Onoda and his men, was simply forgotten. The surrender of Japan. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice was broadcast across Japan and to Japanese forces throughout the occupied territories. It was the first time most Japanese citizens had heard their emperor speak. His message was delivered in formal, archaic court language that many could barely understand. But the meaning was unmistakable. Japan had accepted the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. The war was over. The empire had surrendered. For soldiers stationed on remote islands and in isolated outposts, the news arrived in fragments, if it arrived at all. Communication networks had collapsed. Command structures had disintegrated. On Lubang, Onoda and his men heard nothing. They had no radio. They had no contact with higher command. They continued their patrols, rationed their ammunition, and waited for orders that never came. In the weeks and months following the surrender, Allied forces and the newly established Philippine government attempted to reach the Japanese holdouts scattered throughout the archipelago. Leaflets were dropped from aircraft. They announced the end of the war, showed photographs of the surrender ceremony, and urged soldiers to come out of hiding. Loudspeakers were set up in the jungle, broadcasting messages in Japanese, sometimes including recordings of family members pleading for their sons to return home. On Lubang, these efforts were met with silence. Onoda did not believe the leaflets. This was not paranoia. It was tactical reasoning. The Allies had used psychological warfare throughout the Pacific campaign. False surrender notices were a known tactic, designed to draw soldiers out of hiding so they could be captured or killed. Onoda had been trained to expect deception. The leaflets were printed on clean paper, in suspiciously perfect Japanese. The photographs could be forgeries. The voices on the loudspeakers could be actors. To Onoda, these were not messages from his government. They were enemy propaganda, and responding to them would be a betrayal of his mission. But there was something deeper at work. Onoda's training had instilled a specific worldview. The emperor does not surrender, Japan cannot be defeated, and the war is an existential struggle that will be fought to the last man. Even if some part of him suspected the leaflets were genuine, accepting them would mean accepting that everything he had been taught was a lie. It would mean that his commanders had abandoned him, that his emperor had failed, and that his sacrifice had been meaningless. That psychological barrier was almost insurmountable. The first years after the war ended were the most dangerous. Onoda and his men were not passively hiding. They were conducting active operations. They raided farms for food, burned rice stores to prevent them from falling into enemy hands, and occasionally fired on Filipino civilians whom they believed to be enemy combatants. From their perspective, Lubang was occupied territory, and the Filipinos working the land were collaborators with the Allied forces. From the perspective of the islanders, these were attacks by bandits who refused to accept reality. In 1949, one of the four men broke. Yuichi Akatsu, the youngest of the group, could no longer endure the isolation. He left the jungle and surrendered to Filipino authorities. His defection was a shock to the remaining three, but it also reinforced Onoda's belief in the correctness of his own position. Akatsu had been weak. He had succumbed to enemy propaganda. His surrender proved nothing except that not every man had the strength to continue the mission. Onoda, Shimada, and Kozuka adapted. They developed a routine of survival that would sustain them for decades. They moved their camp every few days, never sleeping in the same location twice. They built temporary shelters from palm fronds and bamboo, designed to be abandoned at a moment's notice. They maintained a strict schedule of reconnaissance, noting the movements of Filipino patrols, the locations of new settlements, and any changes in the island's infrastructure. They believed they were gathering intelligence for the inevitable Japanese counterattack. Food was a constant concern. The men hunted wild animals, primarily water buffalo and cattle that belonged to local farmers. They ate bananas, coconuts, and wild plants. They carefully rationed the rice they stole from farms, knowing that resupply was impossible. They preserved their uniforms by stitching them with fibers stripped from tree bark. They maintained their rifles with meticulous care, cleaning them daily and hoarding their remaining ammunition. Every action was calculated to extend their operational capacity indefinitely. But the psychological cost was immense. They had no news from the outside world. They did not know if Japan still existed, if their families were alive, or if the war they were fighting had any meaning beyond the borders of Lubang. They created narratives to sustain themselves. They told each other that the leaflets were part of a prolonged deception, that Japan was regrouping, that reinforcements would arrive once the strategic situation allowed it. These were not delusions. They were coping mechanisms, necessary fictions that allowed them to continue functioning in an impossible situation. In 1952, letters and photographs from their families were dropped into the jungle. The messages were personal, written in the handwriting of mothers and siblings, begging them to come home. Onoda examined the letters carefully. The handwriting looked authentic, but that proved nothing. The letters contained information that could have been extracted from captured records. More importantly, the letters asked them to surrender, which no loyal family member would do if Japan was still fighting. Onoda concluded that the letters were sophisticated forgeries, designed to exploit their emotional vulnerabilities. He burned them. The 1950s and 1960s passed. Japan transformed itself from a defeated empire into an economic powerhouse. The American occupation ended. The country rebuilt its cities, established a pacifist constitution, and integrated itself into the global economy. Emperor Hirohito, whose voice had announced the surrender, remained on the throne but was reduced to a symbolic figurehead. The generation that had fought the war aged, and their children grew up in a society that barely resembled the one their parents had known. On Lubang, none of this mattered. Onoda's war continued. In May 1954, Shimada was killed. He was shot by a search party that had been sent to find the holdouts. His death was reported in Japanese newspapers, but Onoda and Kozuka never learned of it. To them, Shimada had been killed in combat with enemy forces, another casualty of the war they were still fighting. The two remaining men adapted again. They tightened their operational security, reduced their exposure, and continued their mission. For nearly 2 decades, Onoda and Kozuka survived together. They developed a partnership built on absolute mutual dependence. They communicated in shorthand, anticipated each other's actions, and shared a reality that no one else on Earth could fully understand. They were not friends in any conventional sense. They were soldiers, bound by duty and isolation. They rarely spoke about the past or speculated about the future. They focused on the present, on the immediate tasks of survival and the execution of their mission. In October 1972, Kozuka was killed. He and Onoda were burning rice in a field when they were spotted by local police. A firefight erupted. Kozuka was struck by a bullet and died almost instantly. Onoda escaped into the jungle. He was now alone. For the first time in 27 years, he had no one to share the burden of his war. The isolation that had been difficult with companions became almost unbearable in solitude. But he did not surrender. He had his orders, and those orders had not been rescinded. Norio Suzuki was not a soldier, not a government official, and not a historian. He was a 24-year-old Japanese adventurer, a college dropout who had decided to travel the world in search of 3 things: a panda, the abominable snowman, and Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda. The first 2 were jokes. The third was not. By the early 1970s, Onoda had become a legend in Japan, a ghost from the war, a man rumored to be still alive in the Philippine jungle. Most people assumed he was dead. Suzuki thought otherwise. In February 1974, Suzuki traveled to Lubang with a tent, a camera, and a reckless disregard for his own safety. He hiked into the interior of the island, sleeping in the jungle and asking locals where the Japanese soldier had last been seen. On February 20th, he encountered Onoda. The meeting was accidental. Suzuki was sitting by his campfire when Onoda emerged from the trees, rifle raised. Suzuki did not run. He called out in Japanese, identifying himself as a fellow countryman. Onoda lowered his rifle but did not relax. He questioned Suzuki carefully, suspicious that this was another form of enemy deception. Suzuki told Onoda the truth. The war had been over for nearly 30 years. Japan had surrendered. The emperor was alive, and the country was at peace. Onoda listened, but he did not believe. He had heard these claims before. What finally convinced him that Suzuki was genuinely Japanese, and not an enemy agent, was Suzuki's complete ignorance of military protocol. No actor trained by the Allies would be so careless, so informal, so unmistakably civilian. Suzuki was real. But that did not mean his information was accurate. Onoda explained his position. He would not surrender based on the word of a civilian. He would not surrender based on leaflets or photographs or letters from his family. He would surrender only if he received a direct order from his commanding officer, relieving him of his duties. Suzuki understood. He returned to Japan and informed the government that Onoda was alive, uninjured, and willing to surrender under specific conditions. The Japanese government faced an unusual problem. Onoda's former commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, had long since left the military. He was now a bookseller, living a quiet civilian life. But he was the only person with the authority to issue the order Onoda would accept. The government located Taniguchi, explained the situation, and asked him to return to the Philippines. Taniguchi agreed. In March 1974, he traveled to Lubang, accompanied by Suzuki and Philippine officials. On March 9, 1974, Taniguchi entered the jungle and called out for Onoda. Onoda approached cautiously, rifle ready, until he recognized his former commanding officer. Taniguchi was no longer a young man. He was 62 years old, dressed in civilian clothes, carrying documents that formally relieved Onoda of his duties. He read the orders aloud. "You are hereby relieved of all military duties. His Majesty the Emperor has granted you permission to return home." Onoda stood at attention, saluted, and for the first time in 29 years, he allowed himself to believe that the war was over. The surrender ceremony took place at a designated location on Lubang. Onoda wore his tattered uniform, which he had maintained as best he could over the decades. The fabric was patched with fibers from the jungle, but the shape was unmistakably that of an Imperial Japanese army officer. He carried his sword, his rifle, which still functioned, and several hundred rounds of ammunition. He also brought his military dagger, hand grenades, and a detailed map of Lubang that he had kept updated throughout his isolation. Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos presided over the ceremony. The political symbolism was carefully managed. Marcos needed to balance domestic anger over the decades of violence Onoda had inflicted on Filipino civilians with the diplomatic advantages of appearing magnanimous. He granted Onoda a full pardon, framing the surrender as the final closure of the Second World War. Onoda saluted, bowed, and formally surrendered his sword. Japanese officials received him as a representative of the government. The ceremony was brief, formal, and laden with unspoken complexity. Onoda was flown to Manila and then to Japan. The reception he encountered was overwhelming and disorienting. Thousands of people gathered at the airport. News cameras filmed his arrival. Reporters shouted questions. The government organized a formal welcome, treating him as both a war hero and a relic of a past the country had spent decades trying to forget. Onoda stood in the center of this attention, expressionless, struggling to process a world that no longer resembled anything he had known. The Japan he returned to in 1974 was unrecognizable. Tokyo had been rebuilt with skyscrapers and neon lights. The population dressed in Western clothing and moved through life at a pace that seemed incomprehensible to a man who had spent 3 decades measuring time by the position of the sun. The economy was booming. Japan had become one of the wealthiest nations on earth. The emperor was still alive but had been transformed into a constitutional figurehead with no political power. The military, which had once been the defining institution of Japanese society, had been replaced by the Self-Defense Forces, a limited organization constrained by a pacifist constitution. Onoda gave interviews, but he spoke carefully. He did not apologize for the Filipinos he had killed. From his perspective, he had been a soldier following orders in a war that, for him, had never ended. He did not express regret for the years he had spent in the jungle. He had done his duty. What disturbed him was not the past, but the present. He looked at modern Japan and saw a nation that had abandoned the values he had fought to preserve. He saw materialism, individualism, and a casual disregard for discipline and sacrifice. He did not say this publicly, but it was clear in the way he moved through the world. He was a man out of time, unmoored from the society that was supposed to welcome him home. Onoda struggled to adapt. The attention was relentless, the questions repetitive, and the expectations impossible to meet. Japan wanted him to be a symbol, but it could not decide what kind of symbol he should be. To some, he was a hero, a man who had remained loyal to the emperor and the nation when others had surrendered. To others, he was an embarrassment, a reminder of the militarism and fanaticism that had led Japan to disaster. Onoda wanted neither role. He wanted only to be left alone. In 1975, Onoda emigrated to Brazil. He purchased a cattle ranch in Mato Grosso do Sul and attempted to build a quiet life far from the scrutiny of the Japanese media. The ranch was remote, the work was physical, and the isolation was familiar. For nearly a decade, he lived as a rancher, managing cattle, repairing fences, and avoiding the world that had no place for him. He married a Japanese woman, Meichi, whom he had met in Tokyo before leaving Japan. They did not have children. The life he built in Brazil was functional, not happy, but it was sustainable. But Onoda could not entirely escape his past. In 1984, he published an autobiography, No Surrender, My 30-Year War. The book was a meticulous account of his years on Lubang, written with the same precision he had applied to his military operations. It was not a work of self-justification or sentimentality. It was a detailed report of survival, strategy, and the psychological mechanics of belief. The book became an international bestseller, translated into multiple languages, and established Onoda as a figure of enduring fascination. In the book, Onoda reflected on the nature of his experience. He wrote that he did not regret following his orders, but he acknowledged the cost. He described the loneliness of his final years alone on Lubang, the weight of command when there was no one left to command, and the realization that the world he had been fighting for no longer existed. He also addressed the question that everyone asked: why did he not surrender earlier? His answer was simple. He had been given orders, and those orders had not been rescinded. To surrender without official relief would have been a betrayal of everything he had been trained to uphold. He could not live with that betrayal. In the late 1980s, Onoda returned to Japan and established a nature school for young people. The school, called the Onoda Nature School, was located in a rural area and focused on outdoor survival, discipline, and traditional values. Onoda believed that modern Japanese youth had lost the resilience and self-reliance that had once defined the national character. He did not seek to indoctrinate students with militarism, but he did seek to teach them skills he believed were essential: self-sufficiency, respect for authority, and the ability to endure hardship without complaint. The school was moderately successful. It attracted students from urban areas whose parents worried that their children were growing up soft, disconnected from nature and tradition. Onoda taught classes personally, demonstrating survival techniques, leading hikes, and lecturing on the importance of duty and perseverance. He did not talk much about his years on Lubang, but the experience informed everything he taught. He was not trying to recreate the past. He was trying to preserve values he believed were worth maintaining, even in a world that had moved on. Onoda continued to give interviews occasionally, always reluctantly. He spoke at veterans events and participated in historical documentaries. He returned to Lubang in 1996, visiting the island that had defined his life. He met with Filipino officials and survivors of the attacks he had carried out. The meetings were awkward, formal, and marked by unresolved grief on both sides. Onoda did not apologize. He acknowledged the suffering his actions had caused, but he maintained that he had been a soldier, not a criminal. The distinction mattered to him, even if it meant little to those who had lost family members to his bullets. In his final years, Onoda lived quietly in Tokyo with his wife. He avoided public attention and spent his time reading, gardening, and maintaining correspondence with former students and fellow veterans. He died on January 16, 2014, at the age of 91, from heart failure. His death was reported widely in Japan and internationally. Obituaries struggled to summarize a life that resisted easy categorization. He was not a hero in the conventional sense, nor was he a villain. He was a man who had followed his orders with a completeness that bordered on the inhuman, and who had paid for that obedience with 30 years of his life. Hiroo Onoda's story is not about courage or madness. It is about belief, and the terrifying power of belief when it is systematically constructed and reinforced by institutions designed to override individual judgment. Onoda was not an outlier. He was the logical endpoint of a military culture that valued obedience above survival, duty above reason, and the mission above the man. His training had been so thorough, so complete, that even when the war ended, even when the empire collapsed, even when every rational indicator suggested that his mission was obsolete, he could not stop. He had been built to fight, and he fought until someone with the proper authority told him to stop. The question of whether Onoda wasted 30 years of his life is unanswerable because it depends on a framework of values that Onoda did not share. From the perspective of modern individualism, his sacrifice was pointless, his loyalty misplaced, and his refusal to adapt a form of self-destruction. From his own perspective, he had fulfilled his duty. He had not surrendered, he had not betrayed his orders, and he had maintained his honor in a world that had abandoned its own. The gap between these perspectives is unbridgeable. What Onoda's story reveals is that wars do not end when treaties are signed or when guns fall silent. They end when the soldiers stop fighting, and some soldiers never stop. Onoda's war continued in his mind long after it ceased to exist anywhere else. The jungle was his reality, the mission was his purpose, and the possibility that it had all been for nothing was a truth he could not afford to accept until he was given permission to do so. His story is a testament to the durability of human conviction, the resilience of the human body under impossible conditions, and the cost of total obedience to an ideology that cannot acknowledge its own collapse. Hiroo Onoda was the last Japanese soldier to surrender from the Second World War. He walked out of the jungle in 1974, handed over his sword, and returned to a world that had no place for him. He lived another 40 years, never quite reconciled to the peace he had been ordered to accept. His war had ended, but the soldier never truly came home.